So what's your name?
My name is Guy Herman Jr.
Where and when were you born?
I was born in Caldwell County in 1941.
Where'd you grow up?
Well, I pretty much grew up in the Lenoir area. When I was about 18, I moved down into the Union Grove area down off the Common Springs Road, but basically in the city of Lenoir.
Where have you lived other than that?
I lived in Winston-Salem for a while, and my military time I was in the Philippines for a while. But basically I've spent the majority of my time in Caldwell County.
What jobs have you had over your years?
Well, I've had a lot of jobs. When I was in high school, I had a part-time, my first job was a bag boy at the Thrift Food Center, which was the first job I had, and that was carrying groceries out and stocking stores. And then when I was in high school, I had a part-time job at a wholesale house where I was responsible for grinding coffee. So I did that. And then after that, I, of course, went into the military. When I got out of the military, I had a job for about a month in the furniture factory. And then after that, I went to work for a small loan company worked there about 6 months. And then I went to work for a bank, and the rest of my career was 40 years of banking.
What do you do now for a living, or are you retired?
Well, I officially retired, several years ago, and now I don't do this for a living, but I do some electrical work, and I have my electrical license and do that kind of stuff.
Can you describe your early childhood home and where you lived?
Oh yeah, my early childhood, of course, during my very early years, my dad was in the Second World War, and we lived out on the West College Avenue in a house there, and I spent a lot of my time down in the Hudson area off the Walton Army Road with my grandparents. My mother and I stayed with them a lot while he was in the war, and then after that we pretty much lived in the Virginia Street, Urban Avenue area out there. And then, as I said earlier, we moved down on Union Grove Road when I was about 17 years old, and I lived there for about a year.
Did you have any brothers and sisters that you remember?
Right, I had one brother. He was 10 years younger than I am, and when there's a 10-year difference, you don't have a lot of things in common growing up. You're pretty much a babysitter rather than a sibling that's a friend, so to speak. But after I got out of the military, he and I enjoyed a good relationship because he had grown up and we enjoyed the more mature things. And unfortunately, he only lived to age 42. He passed away at 42, so that left me without any siblings.
How extensive was your childhood education?
Well, my education was the typical high school education. It was very good back in those years because we had a lot of good teachers, and we had very, very few distractions as such, because it's kind of hard to remember, but there wasn't a lot of TV and electrical things that are commonplace today.
What was your favorite job that you've ever had?
Well, I loved banking. That was really a job that I thoroughly enjoyed. I had a passion for it, and I spent 40 years in it. It provided me with a lot of educational opportunities and other travel opportunities, things of that nature. So that was my favorite.
What did you do as a baker?
Well, I started out at the lowest level of banking. Back then, I was working in what was called the installment loan department. That's where they make automobile loans, personal loans, things of that nature. And I was the person that went out and repossessed the cars, the people that didn't pay their bills. And from that, I moved up to the assistant manager of the installment loan department at First Union National Bank, and I worked there. I was also transferred to Winston-Salem, and I worked down there as the assistant manager of that installment loan department. And then I had an opportunity to go to work in the savings and loan business, so I went to work in that business. And worked in there for 20 years, and I was able to move up the ladder to the point of being vice president. And I was on the board of directors, and we ended up selling that bank, and I went to work for the bank that bought us was SunTrust. And I became the first vice president of SunTrust and worked for them for 9 years prior to my retirement. So I kind of grew up in banking, and it's kind of hard to fathom now, but I grew up in a time before computers. And even in banking, we would have to do our own calculations, and we had ledger cards, and we'd have to compute interest by hand. We had to do a lot of that. There were no credit cards, and I was in charge of introducing the first credit card in Lenore, which was with First Union National Bank back then, and it was called First Bank Card. And the merchants then were very reluctant to offer that credit card because they had to pay a 5% fee on every purchase. And they didn't want to pay that fee, of course, and they couldn't envision the fact that down the road they wouldn't be able to operate without credit cards. You can imagine people today with no credit cards, they wouldn't be in business. So I got to see a first in that, and I got to see a first in banks going on computers and things of that nature. So I witnessed a lot of changes in the banking industry in 4 years.
Did you serve in the military?
Yes, I served in the military in the early, 1960 through the early part of 1963. And I was in an organization called the Army Security Agency, which is just a branch of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And all the stuff that we did was classified, and we were sworn not to discuss the things that we did after our military service, but I had a top secret clearance and was exposed to things that a lot of people never have an opportunity to be exposed to. We were being stationed in the Philippines. I was over there for approximately 30 months, and we were in the intelligence gathering business, basically. That's what the CIA does now and what we did then. And this was prior to the Vietnam War. Vietnam War started shortly after 1963, and of course we were pretty busy in trying to gather intelligence and things of that nature.
Did you learn anything while you were in the military skills-wise?
In the military as such, you just have the normal basic training. My job did not require fighting per se as far as military weapons. We'd have to do the normal qualifying once a year and all of that, but it was kind of ironical that you asked that. Back then, and again, this is many years ago, but I studied karate in the Philippines. That before anybody had ever heard of karate over here. And karate originated in Okinawa, and the Philippines Filipinos learned it from the Okinawans, and I enjoyed that while I was over there. That was one of my pastimes that I had to do every other day. I'd go down to we didn't do it at the gym, we did it at the place where the instructor lived. And I attained a brown belt in karate while I was there, and it was a different type of karate from what you see here in the United States. In the United States, they have what's called form karate, where you do different moves in different forms. But over there, they taught you the deadly type blows, how you can, actually strike a person in an area that can take their life. It's necessary. So it kind of a different situation, but it was interesting. And to this day, I still work out and still practice my karate and do that kind of stuff.
Can you describe the living conditions that you worked in?
My living conditions were very nice. I worked, 98% of my work was in a building. The building had no windows at all. we had a big 8-foot fence around the building, and they kept guards on it at all times, and only those people that had the proper clearances could come and go. But, the building was nice, pretty hot in the Philippines, so the building was air conditioned, and one of the good points, we had generators as backup power, but when the power would go off, it's pretty dark in a building with no windows, so I could catch a nap every now and then pretty quickly there. So learned how to go to sleep real quick.
Do you have any interesting stories about your deployment?
Interesting stories. Well, I think as a little bit of a lesson, I don't have any stories that I can talk about on my deployment, but I learned one thing early on in my military service. When I was growing up in Caldwell County, I didn't think about it at the time, but all of my friends were friends that I had grown up with. They were friends with my mother and dad. And I was kind of had a very limited outlook on things. So I went in the military, and I was thrown in from people from all over the United States, and I was sent to Fort Devens, Massachusetts for my training. And I got up there and I began to look around, and on the weekends, all of a sudden everybody was gone and having a big time, and I was just sitting around doing nothing. And I got to think, well, what in the world's wrong here? And then I realized that I wasn't making any effort to make any friends. And I learned early on that if you're going to have friends, you need to be a friend. And you need to get involved. And so I think the main thing about my military was it broadened my outlook on things. I saw more of the world. And I think that's real important for young people, is that they realize that there are a lot of opportunities in places other than where you may grow up. And where your mother and dad have been successful, it may not be that you will be successful. So anything you can do to broaden your horizons, I think you should do that. And the military was one of those things for me.
Would you have changed joining the military?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed the military. It was a very enlightening experience for me. In fact, I personally feel that it would be good for every young man that's physically able to have to serve at least 12 months in the military, because you learn a lot of discipline, you learn the importance of responsibility, and you learn how to, as I said a minute ago, broaden your horizons.
What branch did you originally join? Like the Army, Navy?
Well, it would depend on what you want to do, really. I mean, it just depends on your preference there. I really don't know why I chose the Army, but I did, And once you go in, they test you and determine what areas you're best suited for. And then if there are openings in those particular areas, then that's where you're assigned.
What did you start doing after you came back from the military?
Well, when I came back to the military, the first thing I did was go back to my old employer, and I was just killing time, really. And so I went back to my old employer, and he wanted to know if I was doing anything. And I told him no. He said, well, how about driving a truck for me? So I started as a truck driver. I drove a truck for a few months, and then I drove a truck during the time that we had all these snows around here, and you won't remember that, but back in the 60s, we had 4 weeks where it snowed every Wednesday. And the snow got so deep up in the mountains that helicopters were dropping hay in to feed the animals. So I was driving a truck during those times in the mountains, and that was quite an experience. But I started out driving a truck, and I went from that, as I said earlier, to the furniture factory for a month, the small loan company, and then the banking career.
Are you married?
Oh, yeah. I've been married for 48 years.
Where did you meet?
Well, we met at a place that was the social gathering place of Caldwell County. It's called the Patio or the Kentwood Grill in Lenore. It's still there. It's across from the old mall, and it's now a beauty salon or something now, but it's right there near Western Carolina Electric. and that was called the Kentwood Grill, and that's where all the young people used to hang out, and get to see each other and that kind of stuff.
Did you think she was the one when you first met her?
No.
When did you marry her?
Oh, we married in 1964.
Did you and your wife have any children?
Oh yeah, we had two. We had two sons. We had one in 1967 and we had one in 1969. Both boys, we're very proud of them. They're fine young men.
Do you have any grandchildren?
Oh yeah, I have 4 grandchildren. I have a granddaughter. That was our first grandchild. She's now 18. And I have 3 grandsons. So, and quite proud of all of them. They're exceptionally fine individuals.
Did you have to have any qualifications when you started getting into the banking business?
Well, you need a lot of qualifications. I mean, and it there too depends on where you want to work. But you always need certain skills and knowledge. But I think the most important thing to have in any business you go in, it's what they call people skills. It's able to get along with people. It's able to converse with people. You can talk about having a lot of knowledge. You could be the most knowledgeable person in the world. But knowledge changes. You may be the best computer man today, but tomorrow the computers are going to change. And if you don't keep your knowledge up, you're going to lose ground. But if you have developed people skills and can communicate very well, get along good with people, and enjoy people, then you can be a success in about anything you want to do.
Where did you work first as you became a banker?
I was the repo man for the cars. That was in that was in the latter part of 1963.
Did you have any troubles with that?
No, I didn't have a bit of trouble. Now, it would be a different story today. But then, as I told you, I just got out of the military, and I had a brown belt in karate, so I wasn't too concerned about any problems. But fortunately, I never had any. Had a lot of fun experiences now. I've gone out to repossess cars, and they would have sold their tires. I'd have to go buy 4 tires and put on it to pull it back.
How many years did you spend being a banker?
40 years.
Did you have a job after you left the banking business?
Oh yeah, I had a job. Now this was probably the most fun job. I worked with both of my sons. They were doing electrical work, and so I worked for both of them for 4 years, and we worked kind of as a family, and that was a lot of fun because work is more fun when you don't have to work. I knew I could walk off at any time, and it didn't make a whole lot of difference. So if I needed a day off, I just took a day off. And I was the daddy, so I could take off and tell them to do anything I wanted to do.
Do you have any funny stories that happened over over your time of being a banker?
Funny stories. Well, let's see, Ben. Funny stories in banking. Well, I probably have some, but I better refrain from covering those. Well, I don't. I'll have to think. Funny stories in banking. Well, I'll tell you just one quick funny story, and this is directly related to banking. But I was telling you earlier about charge cards, and First Union introduced their first one. Well, there was this man who was a plant manager at Brawl Hill Furniture, and back then they would send out an advertisement trying to get you as an individual to take a charge card. And they'd put a little pasteboard card on there, and they'd have a name like John Smith. And it was just an example. Well, one day I was sitting in my office, and this guy comes in, and he says, well, said, I appreciate you sending me that charge card, but you got the wrong name on it. And he threw it down on my desk. He said, now get me one with the right name on it. And it was that little old pasteboard card that had John Smith's name on it. And then I remember another time, I was working at a branch in Lenore, and I got a call from a banker in Boone. And he told me that there were a couple of ladies up there that had come into the Boone Bank and closed out this individual's account. And they had made a mistake and gave them the money, and it was just a fraudulent deal. He said, be on the lookout for these two ladies. They may want to cash the check at the nearest branch, which was mine. Well, right after I hung up the phone, I walked out to tell my tellers. I had 4 lady tellers, and to tell them that this person may come in and be on the lookout for them. Well, as I was going back to my office, I looked out the door and I saw these 2 ladies in a car, and one of them got out and she was carrying a bank check in her hand. I could tell that's what it was. So she came in the bank and put the check up on the counter to be cashed, and I thought, how in the world am I going to keep her here until I can get the police? Well, it just so happened we were going to have the grand opening of the bank within a few days, and we were going to give away a TV and some other things, and I had a photographer there from the News Topic, and he was going to take the pictures of the gifts and so forth that we were going to give for advertisement. Well, when she was up there, I told the photographer, I said, we need a picture of this lady. This, again, was before they had all these surveillance cameras that they have now. So I walked out and I told the lady, I said, we need to make a few pictures for this upcoming giveaway at the bank for our grand opening. I wonder if it'd be okay with you. And she said, oh yeah, that'd be fine. So she just stood there, and during the whole time, they shot all kind of pictures of her. And before we got through shooting the pictures, the police walked in and arrested her.
Can you describe for me how Western North Carolina used to look like before everything was modernized, and if it was any different?
Well, Western North Carolina, the things that I remember about the looks and the changes in Western North Carolina as I know it, one of the biggest changes was Interstate 40. Now, when I was younger, there was no interstate, and of course the building of Interstate 40. And they built it in sections. And the section, when I was living down in Winston-Salem, it ended just beyond Statesville. So I would drive, back then I guess the speed limit was about 60 miles an hour. I could drive on the Interstate 40 going to Winston at 60 miles an hour until I got to Statesville. And then I'd pull off and hit a little old 2-lane road and drive it all the way into Winston-Salem until they completed the interstate. So that was one thing that I remember. Another thing I remember, this was in about 19 and let's see, this would have been in about 1965 or 66. 321 from Lenore to Hickory, that goes right by the college now, was a 2-lane road, and there was very little automobile traffic on it. And being the roustabout that I was as a 15, 16-year-old young man, we used to race from Lenore to Hickory on that road. And we could run from Lenore to Hickory on that 2-lane road racing about all the way to Hickory and never meet a car. So those things have changed. And of course I remember the changes in the downtown area. The big thing when I was a young man in Lenore was the monument. And the monument now sits off to the side of Lenore, you know where it is. Well, it used to be right in the center of where the stoplights are now. The 4 roads come together. And it was a circular type monument. So on Saturday night, all the young people that had cars would go up there and just drive up, circle around the monument, and drive back. And that was kind of the Saturday night out for us and going to the movie. And like I say, traffic moved at about 5 miles an hour, and everybody that had a vehicle was up there. So the monument was a focal place before we went down to the Kentwood Grill and met our future wives.
Were things as rushed then as they are now?
Oh, well, no, not really. The only fast pace that I remember back then was on Halloween. On Halloween, if you went to Lenore and walked down the streets, back then, everybody would line the streets and back up against the building. And of course, everybody had a paddle in their hand. And if you got out walking down the street, somebody would pop you on the hind quarter. So you moved pretty quickly then. But no, things were not as rushed back then. Saturday was a big time for business in Lenore because most of the population worked in the furniture factory. And of course, they'd work all week and get their paycheck and come to town on Saturday and buy their groceries and do what shopping they needed to do. So Saturday was a big time in Lenore. It was a big day, and most people would get there early and get a parking place and just watch the people come and go. Kind of like going to the mall today, where you just kind of go down, sit down, and watch the people come and how they're dressed and how they're acting and that kind of stuff.
Do you remember any historical events in your?
Well, I've already told you I was a little ahead of the Vietnam War, but I knew a lot about the Vietnam War. Historical events, I remember some that I guess we'll talk about several of them. And this comes to my oldest son. He was just a small child. And the night that they walked on the moon, he and I stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning to watch him step out on the moon and see what that was like. So I remember that. I remember, of course, the assassination of JFK. That was quite a thing. One other big event was the death of Elvis Presley. Now, that doesn't mean anything to y'all, but the death of Elvis Presley was a big thing in its day. That was an exciting time. And to go even farther back, not in events like we're talking about, but things that I remember personally, I can remember getting the first telephone in our house. Now everybody has landline phones and everybody has cell phones, but back when I was a youngster and being of the age of I was probably about 13, 14 years old before we got a telephone. And back then, when you got a telephone, you were on what was called a party line. And if you picked the phone up to make a call, you'd pick it up and some lady on the other end would say, "Number please." She was a local operator. And she would patch in to the number you were calling. Well, if you were on a two-party line, that meant that you were on the line and some other family was on the line. Now, what would happen was you'd get on a conversation with somebody and these other people would pick up the phone and listen to your conversation. And you could tell when they picked the phone up because it would click. And if you talked too long, somebody on the other end of the line would say, "How about hanging up? I need to make a call." So I remember telephones coming into being. The next big thing I remember was TVs. I was ahead of TV, and TVs started coming in. Back then they had a cabinet that was about 3 feet high and about 2.5 or 3 feet wide, and it had a screen in it that was about a 6-inch screen square. And when they watched TV, the big night for the men was Wednesday nights where they had the Pabst Blue Ribbon fights. And our neighbor had a TV, and we'd go over, and all the women would get in the kitchen and talk, and the men would go in another room and watch the fights on TV. And they would close the doors and cut all the lights out. They thought it was a better picture at night. And when the women would open the door and crack a little light in there, the men would say, "Shut that door! We can't see this TV! Get out of here!" They'd raise all sorts of sound about that. But the TV coming on board was a big thing back then. And another thing I remember that is a little bit different, that won't mean anything to you. It'll be different from what y'all are accustomed to, but when I was in the banking business, I used to do a lot of work with Rooster Bush. And Rooster and I would get together once a week and work out some banking deals on his cars. And he came in one day and he had a car, and I could loan him money on the car depending on the kind of equipment it had. A car may be a whatever model Ford or Chevrolet, and say it'd be worth $5,000. But if it had a radio, and if it had this, that, and the other, you could add a little more money to what it was worth. Well, he brought one in one day that had air conditioning, and I thought, wow, I never heard of a car with air conditioning. And I was talking to Rooster, and he said this. He said, Guy, one day you will not be able to buy a car without air conditioning. And that's come true. Because now air conditioning is like headlights. Everybody has it. But that was something new to me. And of course, there was no such thing as the homes and offices and that sort of thing being air conditioned. So, that was a big event for me. The computers. That also was a big event, because in my work it made us capable of doing a lot more work, a lot more efficiently, and so those are some of the things that stand out in my mind.
Did they affect you in any way, like directly or indirectly?
Well, they affected me directly in about every way. I just said in our business it greatly affected us, because we went from spending 2 days a quarter calculating interest to be paid on savings account to pushing a button and it being done automatically. So, and actually the telephone, you can imagine how life would be without a telephone. And summers were pretty uncomfortable without air conditioning too. You could raise the window, but if you didn't get a little breeze, it was still pretty hot.
Do you think you have any regrets in your life?
Well, I guess a lot of people have regrets on certain things in life. I don't have many. I have been able to enjoy a very good life. For me, it's been an exciting life. I have one, I guess, the biggest regret that I have was that I did not continue my education to the maximum level. Now, as far as the outcome of my life, I ended up, fortunately, I'm probably as well off as I would have been if I had had my education, completed college, and gone on to get advanced degrees. But that is highly unusual, because without that now, you probably could not have the opportunities that I was privileged to have. So that would be one regret.
Would you do it all over again?
I'd love to, yeah. In fact, I said that at my retirement party. I told you I'd worked there for 40 years, and when I retired, they gave me a big party. And when I made my closing remarks, I said, well, if I could live my life all over again, I'd live it exactly the same way.
How would you describe your life in one sentence or word?
One sentence or word? Interesting.